Well, hello everyone. My name is Theodora Hadjimichael. I'm the Chief Executive of Responsible Finance. Thank you everyone for joining today's Responsible Finance webinar on Communities of the Future, which will explore the role of CDFIs in the transition to net zero emissions. As a couple of housekeeping points, today's webinar will be recorded. We also invite members of the audience to submit questions for the panel in the Q&A function, which the speakers will then respond to during the discussion later on. We have a really fantastic lineup of speakers today, which I'll now introduce. So we have Christine Allison, who's the chair of SWIG Finance, a CDFI in the southwest of England. Shanika Amarasekara, who is the Chief Impact Officer at the British Business Bank, with responsibility for the strategy, policy, public affairs, and ESG teams. Simon Crichton, the head of relationship management at Triodos Bank. Nick Robbins, professor in practice at the LSE Grantham Institute on climate change. And Marika Schmidt, innovation lead at Innovate UK. Chairing the session today is James Vaccaro, CEO of the strategy consultancy RePattern, executive director of the Climate Safe Lending Network, and a partner in Bankers for Net Zero. So thank you to all of our fantastic speakers for being here. I'll now hand over to James to get us started.
Thank you very much, and great to be here. I'm only going to say a few words in starting, but really excited by this conversation because the net zero challenge, and I've been in sort of sustainable finance in Triodos in the days when it was only around about the size of many of the members of Responsible Finance now, when we had a balance sheet of 20 million and lending book of about 12 million. And it really felt back then that the possibility of net zero was not even really imaginable. I started in things like renewable energy, or as it was called back then, alternative energy. And now that we're kind of sensing that there is this entire shift of the economy, that it is all embracing, it is no longer something which is over there, out in this kind of potential science fiction. It is right here in every single community. And that's a huge shift for everybody to digest and understand. One of the interesting experiences I had in the years with other values-based banks was a visit to Peru in central Lima. And it wasn't such a CDFI, it was a microfinance organization, but it worked in a local context. And what was interesting is the loan officer, who knew absolutely everybody within a specific district, had been born in that place, knew everybody, everyone knew him by name, the families. And in terms of the process of arranging finance, the risk process was completely different, because rather than needing to ask questions about, well, who are you doing this with and how is it all working and what are the different stakeholders, he already knew that, and as a consequence was able to offer sounding board advice to be quite proactive in being able to figure out how to best support these clients, and had such a vested interest in the success of that particular very narrow community. And what was possible there was the way in which being able to steer that community towards greater sustainability meant that there was a sort of a natural feedback loop that the capacity of that loan officer, and then for that institution, meant that they were never going to do anything which was against that community. Now, how can institutions within the UK emulate that? And in a way, the power of being responsive and responsible, responding to the needs of community, how can that be transformed by being able to understand the map, understand the locality so well that it can also be proactive? Because in terms of the net zero transition, make no mistake, this is going to need an awful lot of activation. It's going to need a lot of support in being able to drive that confidence to be able to invest. in the backdrop of a COVID recovery, in the backdrop of low business confidence, in the backdrop of no easy ways of signposting for SMEs to get technical solutions to be able to kind of make the big leap. Where specifically then CDFIs and local community social investment, place-based finance can make the difference is how to translate this net zero challenge from something that is going to happen in Glasgow, is happening in some other part of the world, is happening in carbon credits for rainforest protection, and translates it into how is net zero going to work round here? Who are the suppliers? Who are the trusted kind of contractors? Where are the skill bases in our neighborhood and in our communities where we can see things coming? So if there were, in the disruptions which might come about in heavy industry or fossil fuel industry closing, it's not going to be solved by the kind of meme of, well, they're going to put a Morrison's here. We understand it's not going to come from somewhere else, that it can come from the seeds which are grown within those communities. I'd extend it as well to communities of interest. Climate Safe Lending Network recently put together a paper all about specific policy interventions which could really assist the path of decarbonising lending. And one of the things which came out as being the most impactful and feasible of policies was a Communities and Climate Reinvestment Act. So in the US, I'm sure people are aware of the Communities Reinvestment Act. It helps mobilize finance into communities to reach the parts that a one-size-fits-all banking sector would not be able to reach. But communities aren't just local. I remember in those early days of Triodos being part of the Hydropower Association conferences, and there's very tight little communities of interest. Where are those tight communities of interest right now within the emerging sectors which could become the scalable solutions of the future? That's, I think, something which we'd love to touch on today. We've got an amazing group of speakers. How are SMEs going to innovate these business models? How are they going to be able to have their the right levels of support proactively and reactively to find the suppliers and to find the different financing streams from a diversity of players? How are CDFIs going to be catalysts in the market? If we're going to have things like the National Infrastructure Bank soon and British Business Bank, which we're going to hear from in just a moment, what is the best opportunity to be able to leverage that within each community? That's a strategy development process. And I'm hoping that the perspectives today can help you all, and I'd invite everybody to really kind of consider and reflect on what they can use to leverage these perspectives in their own strategy development journeys. That's all I'm going to say for now. We're going to hear from each of the panelists, and then would really love to hear your questions and to really get into the debate. So use the Q&A function, and I will pick out some questions and weave them together. I'm now going to hand over to Shanika from British Business Bank to kick us off today. Shanika.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to you about the role which, as James said, responsible finance and community development finance institutions can play in transitioning to net zero. Just a little bit of background. The British Business Bank is the UK government's development bank, which supports access to finance for SMEs across the UK, and therefore a sense of purpose is core to our activities and core to our mandate. And I'm going to talk a bit more broadly about not just net zero, but about ESG as well, because I think these are all interconnected issues as you think about it. And for us, the issues relating to environmental, social, and governance matters, sustainability more broadly, and also the transition to net zero is a really important component of how we deliver our activities. And as an institution, we focus on the supply side of access to finance for smaller businesses, but also thinking about the demand side and the other non-financial related ecosystem that needs to exist for SMEs to thrive and to prosper. So when we look at the role that the British Business Bank has to play in the future, in the transition to net zero. We're very conscious that it's a significant role and our ambition is high. And we work with all providers of finance to SMEs, whether that be the big banks, fund managers, asset finance providers, peer-to-peer lenders, and in particular yourselves, the community development finance institutions. And we feel that the role which James was talking about, which CDFIs play, is a really important one here, because you already operate with a sense of purpose and a sense of social connection to the communities in which you operate, and are just much better connected to those communities than the other financial institutions that we deliver through and work with. I'd probably go so far as to say that while topics around ESG and sustainability are getting very fashionable now amongst all providers of finance, people like yourselves, the responsible finance sector and CDFIs, have been working on these topics from the very inception and from when you first started out. So I feel like the rest of the market is catching up with you, and there's a lot that the rest of the market can learn from how you deliver your core activities. And there's really an opportunity for everyone to share the knowledge here today, I think, and make sure that we are capturing the experiences that this sector has had to be able to take it to the wider market is what we're keen to do. So on the specific topic of transition to net zero, we've also been in discussion with various government departments, because those are our key stakeholders, and we're keen to use our position to be able to leverage policy around this, and have been trying to make sure the voice of the SMEs are heard in the discussions around the transition to net zero. And it's really good to see that that focus is now turning to SMEs. And you may have seen recently Andrew Griffith's business campaign and the net zero commitment, which was launched. And if you haven't seen this, you should take a look. The website has already been published. It's smeclimatehub.org.uk, and Hayes will be launching a full campaign later this month to promote the Climate Business Hub. And the campaign is going to ask for businesses to sign up to and commit to cutting their carbon emissions in half by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. So it's aligned around targets, but there's a lot to be done around how we meet those targets. So at the British Business Bank, we also want to play our part and are intending to conduct a significant research project later this year to really get under the skin of the views of SMEs and to understand in greater detail what the impediments and challenges are for SMEs to transition to net zero. And it's probably worthwhile noting we did a recent piece of research amongst our regional network relationships, which reveal that the current sentiment amongst SMEs is that the transition to net zero and broader ESG topics is not really a priority. It doesn't come up in the top 3 priorities. And as James said, in a backdrop of the economic uncertainty, COVID, Brexit, you can see why it isn't a priority. But I think it's important for us to understand how we shift the transition to net zero and broader ESG topics up the agenda and create not just a compliance or regulatory burden, but also highlight that there are opportunities to be had, and there are providing incentives using access to finance, but also awareness raising and information is an important component for this for SMEs. So I think organizations such as yourselves as CDFIs and responsible finance institutions have a really key role to play. And the fact that you're starting from a footing of trust amongst the communities in which you operate and a broader sense of purpose and social benefit ingrained into how you work means that there's a lot of learning that we can capture from yourselves. And I'm really excited about the conversation we can have today and with the rest of this esteemed panel on this topic, because I think it's an important opportunity. It's an important point of time for us to have these conversations and make sure that we capture all the learning that exists across the market and amplify and multiply it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. I'm now going to pass to Nick Robbins from Grantham Institute, who's been very connected to all this agenda on place-based investment in the just transition. Nick.
Well, thanks, James, and thanks to Responsible Investor for inviting me for this great session. And really fantastic to see the whole program of events you're putting on, Theodora. So that's really good, and really good to follow Shanika from the British Business Bank. Just a little bit about myself. So I'm, as you heard, I'm a professor in practice on sustainable finance, London School of Economics. That means I'm not an academic. I come out of the financial sector, worked at HSBC, worked in fund management, and worked at the UN, and also authored a report for the Climate Change Committee on the road to net zero finance, which set out the sort of key sort of financial challenges, which I'll touch on a little bit. We're also at the LSE part of a research network called the Place-Based Climate Action Network, PCAN, which has university partners in Leeds, in Edinburgh and Belfast. And clearly one of the key issues about place-based action is one sort of that this action responds to the needs and priorities and the opportunities coming from the bottom up, but also how to access and mobilize finance. And then the third is we have pulled together what we call our Finance and Just Transition Alliance. I'm delighted to see that Triodos and British Business Bank and Responsible Finance are all part of that. And that's really to see how can we use this huge opportunity of the net zero transition to deliver positive social impact up and down the country in all the regions, communities that can benefit from that. So I'm just going to talk about sort of three things, if I may, in my sort of remaining sort of 7 minutes or so. First, a little bit about net zero and net zero finance. Second, about the challenge around SMEs and small enterprises, as Shanika started to set out, and then put out maybe sort of 5 ideas about how we can take this forward, stressing that this is a critical year as we come out of COVID. The government's going to put forward its net zero strategy to actually help us to deliver on our goal and to deliver on the commitments we need to deliver by 2030 and 2035. So some ideas for that. So firstly, about the net zero finance challenge we had. This is a huge opportunity for investment-led recovery. We can actually switch our resources away from fossil fuels towards the people and infrastructure and innovators of this country. As a result, growth in this country will increase. We'll have reduced imports of fossil fuels and much more sort of bottom-up innovation and development. So this is a great opportunity. It is capital intensive. It is essentially a shift from a OPEX economy where we hugely resource consumptive, using lots of energy, to much more investment in human capital, but also technology, clearly. So lots more upfront capital. So therefore, finance is really important, upfront capital in every single sector of the economy. And capital needs to increase. From the CCC report, we need to increase our investment in net zero from about 10 billion a year in 2020 to around 50 billion by 2030. It needs to keep on increasing. So if we think this is a smooth shift to net zero by 2050, this is the decade where we really need to scale up fivefold over the whole economy, our investment in net zero. So think about that for CDFIs, at least fivefold expansion of particular financial services and provision for net zero for your members and so on. So that's the sort of net zero background. It's a big upshift in terms of capital deployment. Then the question, particularly, I suppose, about the small businesses, social enterprises, communities that CDFIs serve. SMEs are the heart, as we know, of the whole economy, make up most of employment, huge source of innovation, and particularly important for community cohesion. Actually, with colleagues of Shanika's British Business Bank, we've identified sort of 3 different types of sectors. Obviously, the SME tag it's perhaps not so helpful because there's a huge diversity. But you have sort of green solution providers amongst the SME community. You have then the sort of green adopters, people who will be adopting technologies in their businesses and so on. And then potentially those you could call transition exposed. So those, for example, in fossil fuel supply chains or in high carbon regions that might be exposed to this, and will need particular support on just transition. So I think getting a sense, obviously, of the diversity and the different type of financial tools that might be needed for those 3, again, very broad types of sort of small businesses. Then some ideas, maybe for how we need to sort of take this forward, recognizing this huge scale up in capital that's needed, the huge opportunity, but actually SMEs need to have a very tailored approach. not one which is patronizing, one which really responds to their needs and circumstances and so on. So the first is this sense of how do we mobilize and get that increasing amount of capital flowing to small businesses to enable them to get to net zero, deliver on ESG, and deliver on just transition. I think what is so interesting in the conversations I had with organizations on this is we need a system shift. That actually it's not just CDFIs, but CDFIs working with commercial banks, working with British Business Bank and so on. So how do those various pieces come together? So we, at least we do, maybe in the words of your program, Theodora, at least a sort of 10 times increase in CDFI financing for net zero this decade. So that's the first, that's sort of systemic shift. Secondly is the place-based dimension of community development finance institutions. They are rooted in particular places, and Christine will tell us about how she's working with her communities in the Southwest. So how do CDFIs really connect with the climate emergency plans that are coming up around the country, for the sort of the climate roadmaps that many regions are developing? I think they could have a huge role in inputting and helping to deliver on that. Third is the role of the British Business Bank, which Shanika's already set out. And it's really good to see the increasing commitment around ESG and net zero. Are there particular products, are there particular mechanisms, which obviously the BBB already has a whole suite of risk guarantees and mechanisms and so on, but are there ones that could be particularly tailored for this net zero transition? I think it'd be really interesting to see, do we need a specific one, or is it a question simply of integrating net zero and ESG into everything that the BBB does? Then a fourth thought is, I think even if the BBB did scale up and did all those things, we would still need an organization that actually, whose job it is to build capacity and provide technical assistance and make the transition for SMEs easy. We don't have an organization like that. So I've invented one. We need a sort of green enterprise delivery agency whose job is really not necessarily on the financing side, but really to make it easy, responsive for SMEs to make this transition, because they're sort of short on capacity, short on capital, short on time span. How do we have that agency who's really trying to make it easy? And then the fifth idea is around impact. This CDFIs and others all around impact in terms of delivering on net zero, but also on social impact. And I think it'd be really good to see, for example, the social value framework, which is being developed, and I think is very applicable here, but taken up in a very, very user-friendly way. So it's not burdensome for SMEs, but user-friendly way to show how CDFIs are really delivering both on the net zero, but also the just transition in their communities. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nick. I'm now going to pass on to Simon Crichton. It's from Triage Bank. I've declared my allegiances of my previous employer, but I know that there's still so many amazing things kind of still being developed and worked on. Simon.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah, I would like to think we get everything right and do everything right, but we're not, and there's still a huge challenge by far. And I would say that you set out a bit of a challenge about vested interest, and that's, if you like, that worker in Peru. And actually, I think we definitely have an vested interest ourselves in that. I think our customers, and really our customers, are going to be the most impacted by this transition. And so that is the disadvantaged communities, social enterprises, and if okay, let's put another tag on this, SMEs, but something in that smaller space, because of the investment capital constraints that are likely to be put on banks, the pressure that will be there, the regulatory pressure in transition, competitive forces. Big business is going to sort itself out, and it's going to sort itself out really quickly. And then society itself. And I'm supportive of all these pressures, to be honest. So that's the challenge, the inner challenge. I'm supportive of all these pressures, but they are going to hit our customers harder than most. And I would include Triodos in this. So we're right with you on this. And just to give you some examples, there's the UK consistently changing net zero, which is great. Scotland quoting 2045, Manchester quoting 2038. The Isles of Scilly 2030 net zero plan. Arla, one of Europe's largest dairy companies, quoting 2025. If anybody had said 5 or 10 years ago that one of the largest dairy co-ops in Europe was going to have a net zero plan that was ahead of government, you'd have thought they were crazy. But they are, and they're leading the way, and they're going to push for it, and they will achieve it. So the challenge I would say is what's in our own direct control. And this is something that Triodos itself has had to address in terms of, what do our frontline managers, so our managers who are talking to customers, what do they really understand of the challenge and the actions required, and supporting them to navigate this with their customers, so they fully understand from the outset with those conversations. And we won't, well, I say fully understand, we won't understand everything. It's actually just having enough understanding to open that dialogue. And that's one of the challenges I would say. It's noticeable. Lloyds, NatWest are trying to start this, if you like, but that's at such a scale. They're not really getting it down to the relationship managers with customers in a great detail. Whereas we have the opportunity as smaller organisations we're already having real conversations. So the level we can have is just something, again, compared with large banking, and we've got to really drive that forward to make sure we open the customer dialogue on net zero. Supporting and pointing customers so they assess their current position. Measuring is really important, even if it isn't of high quality initially, just to start measuring and understanding their impact towards net zero is really important. And then supporting those customers by highlighting and signposting, making sure they're thinking about when in replacement equipment cycles, they're thinking about the net zero challenge, and rather than just thinking about the immediate need today, what's the future need? And then that allows us to do our job, if you like, as financiers, to structure products and solutions and really think about solutions to how they can be supported and financed. And then obviously we go back into our review cycle with our customers and effectively go back to the start. Have we had the impact that we wanted in the changes we've made? Where are we now in that carbon cycle? And I think these conversations we really need to have. So, and we have it within Triodos in terms of our social lending. We've been incredibly strong with our social lending. And I today give the example of the bank itself. And I mean, the bank built an amazing office in the Netherlands, if you like, which is wholly deconstructable, a net zero carbon in build and in use. Once that building is completed and is no longer useful to the bank, it can be completely deconstructed, and every item within that building is on a register, so it can be reused. And I then compare that with a charity we support, and maybe we supported them in a premises where actually maybe the EPC rating is an E or an F. Maybe they're not able to afford because they're putting everything to the front line of their social immediate need, but they're not able to, in their view, afford to buy renewable energy as a standard, or start looking at how they can retrofit the building, or maybe the products they buy in delivering their service. And it's just to start getting them thinking and moving on this space, because if we don't get them thinking and moving, they will definitely be left behind. And then access to capital won't become easier with our support. It'll actually become more difficult. And actually, potentially, as CDFIs, maybe the access to capital for the CDFIs will become constrained in that as well, in terms of the end net zero impact of the customers that they're financing. I think, so that conversations and dialogue is really important. The next one is giving that examples, and I think it was Nick who mentioned, is actually what we promote and the examples we talk about can really support our customers, and how we position it, actually to look and seek out, if you like, the net zero conversation within all of our lending. Obviously, we're fortunate, we've got some good examples in terms of Ember last year, in terms of the all-electric bus company, but also in terms of, we've got Riverford, who you'd think, right, their primary objective is organic vegetables, and you'd think, right, now they're doing great things because they're looking to support, net zero in terms of the growing methodology of the crop, and also the biodiversity and nature it supports. But actually, they're looking into the whole supply chain, so they've already moved on, and it's that, if you like, that's what we need to start gently maneuvering our smaller customers on towards, and get them in that thinking space. I do believe that actually in our world, actually we're going to need some pump priming to get this going, in the same way as we did with solar PV. And James talked about the carrot and stick, or the another two, not sure which one came first here, James, whether it was the taxes or the grants that came to support this. And to be honest, if it was me, I'd be absolutely delighted if the recovery loan scheme was shifted from a coronavirus centered proposal from the British Business Bank, actually became and joined that net zero COP26. And the announcement was, what a fantastic announcement it would be. And I don't know the exact structure of that now, but if that was in terms of a tiered guarantee developing both social and environmental capital that we hold, and how well that could be placed and delivered by CDFIs to really help transition in the space that you know, I do think will most struggle and needs that signposting as well as the support and carrot. Thank you very much. That's me.
Thanks, Simon. Lots of things to pick up there, and interesting looking at that that whole theme of transition. And when Nick, you brought up that concept of the transition exposed, we have to recall that businesses are in lots of transitions. It's not just a net zero transitions. We're on recovery from COVID. There's a lot happening in the economy. This isn't, the rest of the world doesn't stop to make way for this. But the world does have lots of new ideas and new solutions. And that brings us more into the theme of innovation and new providers. So delighted to have Marika Schmidt at Innovate UK. Marika.
Hello, and I'm just going to share some slides with everyone. Can everyone see that? Yeah, okay. So yes, I work for Innovate UK, the UK's innovation agency. I think the way we operate will change over the next couple of sort of a month and years. We've just appointed a new chief executive. And you might know Innovate UK in the context of sort of SMEs securing grant funding for new projects, innovative projects. That will change, I think, going forward. So more of a focus on how we can mobilize finance and investment going forward. So what I want to focus on today is really one of the existing programs that we've been running, and tell you a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned and what some of the solutions could sort of look like. I ought to say as well that I have a background in a sort of local authority background. I used to work for Bristol City Council and delivered their large-scale energy investment program there. So some of it has sort of fed into that as well. So the program that I'm involved in is really forward-thinking because it's all about smart local energy systems. It's a 102.5 million program. And I think the really interesting thing, without going into any details on this, is that it's trying to integrate quite a number of technology solutions to achieve net zero. Okay, so Nick has mentioned systemic approaches and that they're important, and this is what this is trying to do really for the first time at scale. And I think the really interesting thing here is that the purpose of this, when it started 2 years ago, was to really look into how can we scale projects, okay? How can we replicate and scale projects from sort of when they first start out, and what is required to actually do that? What kind of finance and investment decisions do we need to take? How do we get there? When I talk about integrated solutions, I'm just going to give you a quick example. It's really about delivering things like, for example, a solar PV installation plus battery storage, integrating that all with a digital platform. So really trying to use all of the options that are available to achieve net zero. And what's become really clear, I think, is we have local authorities involved in the program, we have SMEs involved in the program, we have investors involved in the program. So the whole, if you like, ecosystem. And I just want to talk a little bit about this because we often forget about this when we talk about net zero, because we need quite a wide range of interventions, not just SME focused. So it's our belief that it's a whole ecosystem that we need to look at. In terms of the SMEs that are involved in our programs, it's become quite clear that there needs to be more sort of financial products and services that they can access. So we're looking at that. But one thing that's become very clear when we looked at this integrated program is that there is a lot more to finance and investment than just sort of looking at the SMEs. So to start with, we looked more at the SMEs. That's been shifting over the course of this program. And it's been recognized that project finance is quite a thing that we need to look at and become more aware of and find solutions. So we've been looking at what kind of numbers do we have at the moment? What kind of investment do we actually need at the local level? You know, most local authorities have declared a climate emergency, but you know, how do we get there? What kind of investment is required? I've looked at that and there's not that much out there. So there's some figures from the energy hubs. That's a base scheme that's been put in place. 84 million is the current pipeline, but there's obviously huge potential for more. We have therefore decided to really look at that. And I'm currently working with PwC and the University of Leeds on this to really model what kind of investment we require in places and how we can get to the point where we scale this and how can we sort of develop end-to-end delivery solutions. As part of the program, we've also done work with sort of all of our project partners, if you like, on finance and investment. And I just want to share some of the results with this. So the Energy Systems Catapult is one of our delivery partners, has been leading on this, and their report is coming out on the 20th of May. So we did carry out semi-structured interviews with investors, local authorities and SMEs just to see how we can bring these groups together. What is really interesting is that the investors are telling us that cash flow and good credit ratings are really important, that investor confidence needs to be increased, particularly when it comes to more integrated net zero projects. And obviously there needs to be certainty around policy and regulation as well. And a really interesting sort of point that's come across, I think, is that more standard approaches to project planning and delivering to bring due diligence costs down is needed. So that's something that we're very focused on at the moment, because sort of all of our projects after 2 years of delivering things on the ground are starting to look at that. And there needs to be a framework almost that sort of becomes good practice that everyone can sort of buy into and use so that projects can be scaled more easily. Local authorities' insights are all around resource capabilities quite often. Local authorities also would like to just know from some of the financial institutions what the framework of investment principles is, and would like to have more guidance in terms of how do they prepare projects from a financing point of view. What's become clear as well is that there's not always a credible project pipeline sort of available to buy into at the local level. And then another point is procurement frameworks. And I've recently had conversations with Hadjimichael Treasury about this, particularly for the more integrated net zero project delivery. We don't have the relevant procurement frameworks yet in place so that you can quickly deliver these projects on the ground. The SMEs that are involved in our program, there's some interesting messages there as well. It's often about having a really clear proposition regarding the customer value, particularly when it comes to more integrated solutions. It's often customer focused and it needs to be really clearly communicated overall. Clear revenue streams and demonstration of scale, really also an interesting message that's come out of the research that we've been doing. Quickly touch on the National Infrastructure Bank, because obviously I'm talking about the whole ecosystem here that we need to sort of look at and barriers that are there for overall delivery. This is just a summary, but what I'd like to point out to you is that really good development in terms of having an advisory service for local authorities and other project sponsors to support project development. I think that's going to be key to get this in place for this to work so that we mobilize local place-based projects a lot easier. There's a lot of barriers at the moment, and I've just touched on some of them. And we need to overcome that, because I believe that SMEs will benefit from this if we do, because if we get these, if we get to the point where net zero projects can be scaled more easily, that is of benefit to SMEs as well. And this is really the final slide for me, just to give you a bit of an idea of what we're thinking about at the moment, what some of the barriers are, what some of the solutions could be. Obviously, what's still being shaped is how Innovate UK is going to take some of this forwards, because obviously as an organization, we're moving from being a grant funding delivery body towards a much bigger remit at the moment. So for us, finance frameworks really important, really recognizing sort of place-based approaches to net zero and ensure guidance allows for innovative financial products and services to be developed. And I think from our point of view, we'd like to show the pathway as well. So obviously the Prospering from the Energy Revolution program, we have learned a lot of lessons there, and more of that is required so that we can work out what the solutions are that we need for the whole of the system, not just for one sort of element of it. And I think we can play a role there. New financial products and services, we are obviously talking to the National Infrastructure Bank, to the British Business Bank about some of this. And there's sort of two main strands. One is around really providing more finance for SMEs. We already have a couple of things like the VC fund in place, but obviously that needs to be strengthened. Also, sub-sovereign green bonds, municipal bonds, really how can we mobilize finance locally? And it's probably not yet mentioned, but the National Infrastructure Bank will provide cornerstone funding guarantees. And obviously the discussion is about what do we do at the regional, sub-regional level? How can that be transferred into action on the ground? And then I've mentioned this already, a big piece of work for me at the moment is how can I sort of standardize project delivery and assessment tools? And it might sound like, why is this not in place? I don't know is the answer, but having delivered a large energy program in Bristol, it's not in place at the local level, okay? The local authorities, other bodies, project developers, they all use different ways of developing and delivering their projects. And if we were able to provide good practice in this area, then we could probably aggregate projects, smaller projects, into bigger projects, and therefore they become more interesting in terms of the financing and investment side of things. And then finally, international investors, that's sort of something that we're looking at from our point of view as well, investor panels. How can we really, as an agency, become the go-to place for international work in this area? And what can we do with some of the ongoing projects that we have as well? How can we get more investor involvement? We obviously have investor partnerships, but there's options to do a lot more in this field to bring all of the communities that I've mentioned together. And that's it pretty much for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marika. Really exciting, I think, and a hugely necessary development in the UK context, especially given the advisory services and power of institutions like European Investment Bank and InvestEU no longer applying to us. So really interesting to sort of see that emerging ecosystem. Final speaker today, Christine Allison from SWIG, Southwest Investment Group, to talk to us again your perspectives on this issue.
Thanks, James, and good morning, everybody. It's a bit hard to come last after so many wonderful speakers, but I'll try and bring, I think, a different dimension to the conversation. I think one of the first things for me, which is really fascinating, is that I very much live the think global, act local mantra, which I learned when I went to the Harvard Business School, because I had 20 odd years in the World Bank doing a lot of thinking globally and thinking that you can sort of do marvelous things with the world by sitting in fabulous offices and just sending out your great thoughts to the world. But now that I sit here down in the southwest of England and chair the Southwest Investment Group, which as you all know is a CDFI, I am really living for me, in some sense, the dream of being the local. And it is very interesting to sort of sit down here in the southwest of England and think about how we will actually do more and better around the natural capital carbon agenda than we're already doing. I was listening a couple of days ago to another presentation on the Dasgupta review, which I'm sure many of you will have read too. And it's very interesting that when he starts talking about how to implement his framework around how you think about natural capital, he talks very much about the polycentric structures that are needed to really bring about impact. And I think, that is so true, that it's sort of from the point of view of each and every one of us and individuals in our households, through community-based, local-based organizations like my CDFI, up to many other actors, that we are all in this together and need to work very much together to bring the the best we can to the table. So speaking now a bit about sort of SWIG as a CDFI and how we are thinking about this new agenda, I think the first thing to say is that it's not new for us. The E of ESG has definitely been embedded in the work of most CDFIs as long as they've existed, and certainly for us down here in the Southwest, it's very part of what we do. But that said, I think I would be misleading if I said I think we've been given adequate attention to the environment, and certainly net zero, because we haven't. So it's definitely now coming up our to-do list, and it's something we've definitely got to up our game on and be a real leader for the SME sector and in many other ways as well. It's sort of interesting to think about how being local is in this post-COVID year. I mean, if I'd been having this conversation with you 15 months ago, I would have spoken very much about a CDFI that is very much out there, having face-to-face contact with all our borrowers and our potential borrowers. And it would have been very much a sort of an old style relationship sort of based organization. With COVID, we have, like many other organizations, have to back away from being face-to-face. And so, we have had to develop a new way of working with our clients in the past year, which of course has been terrific in terms of our own carbon footprint has been reduced. We haven't got people on the road because remember, we cover everything from Bristol down to the Scilly Isles and back around through Dorset. It's a huge patch. So we are now very happy that we've got a sort of hybrid model whereby we seem to have very good relationships with our SME clients, and yet we're managing to stay locally engaged and relationship. Now, going forward and scaling up, which is one of our agendas, this isn't going to be, it is going to be a challenge. But if I may, let me speak about three other kind of challenges that I think we face as a CDFI that is really, really wanting to engage with net zero, be a sector leader and do much more in the space. I think the first thing is, which has been touched on by the other speakers, is where our clients, the SMEs, are at the moment. And they are across the spectrum in terms of having embraced the environment, doing good things for the environment, understanding what net zero is all about, and being ready to roll, already rolling actually. But that's probably minority. I have had access to the British Business Bank survey that Shanika was alluding to. And I mean, it's really interesting that less than 50% of SMEs seem to, be really engaged with the ESG agenda more broadly, let alone net zero. So there is a big piece of work to be done in terms of the SMEs themselves, really understanding what this is all about, what they can do and how they can do about it. And one of the conversations we are having at SWIG at the moment is, do we sort of develop a consultancy wing that is able to advise potential clients, or do we hope that other people come along and do that, so the SMEs that we want to work with are investment ready and really can just take the money and the investment that we have in order to help them. That's, I think, something we need to talk much more about. So the SMEs themselves are going to be a very mixed batch in terms of where they are on the spectrum of embracing net zero, how prepared they are, and what they can do. For us, we may have to sort of think quite seriously about having what you call a red flag with some potential borrowers, that they are just so not on the right trajectory that for the moment we really shouldn't invest in them. That will be a tough one for us, but I think it's something we may have to face up to. On the other side of the coin is where our money comes from. Now, we have to raise the capital that we on lend from a whole variety of sources. Now, in the last 3 or 4 years since I've been involved with SWIG, we are actually raising a lot more of our own capital. We have a lovely relationship with Triage, which is working very well. And we have quite a bit of flexibility about how we will deploy that capital. That said, we have legacy funds, which we're still deploying, which some of which is EU money. It's money from the British Business Bank and other places that actually comes with quite a lot of conditions and constraints imposed on it. So we are not sitting in a situation where we have access to capital that we can just impose our own lending constraints on and decide, how and when we might want to lend. So I think that's another consideration for us, is looking at our future sources of capital. Where's it going to come from? And is it going to be on the same page as we are, aligned completely around the net zero that we want to pursue? Or are we going to find that we are actually having to sort of constrain our own ambition because the capital is asking that of us? I mean, also a consideration for a CDFI like us is the risk exposure. We have participated in all the guarantee schemes that have been up to date so far, and we will soon participate in the recovery loan scheme once we're approved. But beyond that, we would need to have quite a lot of understanding about what the roadmap looks like for guarantees, assuming that we will be taking on perhaps even higher risk involvement with SMEs than we have done in the past. We're not a great big bank, as the one I used to work for, the World Bank or the commercial banks, where you've got a huge capital underpinning, and you can provide your own risks. We need to have a risk provision arrangement. And I guess the final thing for us is we are not a big organization. We may have big ambition, but our staff are relatively small in number. They're already quite stretched in terms of just the day-to-day jobs they're having to do at the moment. So we're going to have to ask ourselves just how much capacity we're going to have in-house to be able to really dedicate to a more thorough attention to the net zero agenda. And our margins as an operating business are very, very narrow. So for me, it's a fascinating agenda. I am so excited about getting much more engaged with this, but it's not without its challenges. And I hope in the next half an hour of the session that we can really get into some of these challenges and unpack some of the suggestions that have been put on the table about where we go from here. So thank you.
Super, thank you, Christine. I've seen one question come into the Q&A. I'm gonna invite others so we can kind of collect a crop, and we'll get through those and into the debate. Superb diversity of perspectives here. Interesting to kind of pick up on this notion of what is it that SMEs need in terms of this broader support. Marika talked about what Innovate UK will be doing and National Infrastructure Bank. Nick, your concept of the Green Enterprise Delivery Agency, in some ways kind of maybe learning the lessons and building on some of the earlier experience with Carbon Trust before it. I'm wanting to maybe sort of just lean into a first question through a project I'm involved with in the UK called Bankers for Net Zero, working with a group of MPs, working with banks, including Triage. What is it that finance in any form right now could most effectively do to support the transitions, the net zero transition for SME? If there was one thing that your own institution could do, or that we finance collectively could do, what would that be? And given that we're in a COP year, I'm going to give you license to say that if there was going to be a government announcement to support finance on supporting SMEs, what would you most benefit from in a sort of a rush of blood to the head in the UK government the day before COP, and they announce something extra and they tack on a bonus policy? So what would the one thing that finance could most effectively do right now to support SMEs in their transition? I'll open that to anyone, and then we'll harvest the next sets of questions from the Q&A.
Well, let me start there, James. I mean, for me, it's very straightforward. We need finance. The CDFI sector needs finance. We need access to lending capital, and we need access to lending capital sensibly priced, largely unconstrained, as I was saying, and with sensible guarantees, so that we obviously will take and calculate our own risk, but not unrealistically.
And in the ecosystem right now, Christine, of what is available, what are the things which you'd say, I'd like more of this What kind of model could we build on or stretch, or from associative, maybe from all of the recovery from COVID, what might be repurposed into building better forward? Are there particular instruments or kind of ways that you've seen this working successfully? I'm suggesting that could be extended.
Yeah, well, I mean, a good one is actually the Startup Loan Fund, which is run by the British Business Bank. I mean, that's been a huge success, and we are one of the big partners in implementing that. I think that's a terrific model that works very well for new and young businesses. So I think something along those lines would be a good place to start. But let others have a go at this question too.
Yeah, absolutely, perfect. Who'd like to jump in with something else? What would the one thing?
So, I mean, obviously we got Mark Carling telling us that we got to make climate part of every financial decision. So how does that happen here? But also, I think with all the aspects which the panelists have talked about, it actually supporting SMEs through that. So it doesn't appear as a sort of top-down burden. I still think at the UK level, our sort of system of sort of financial intermediation isn't working on this issue. And that we're going to need to think a lot more about that. So we have huge pools of capital, all the major commercial banks, all the major investors, all the major pension funds who want to invest in these areas, but we haven't quite got the connective tissue about it. So I think sort of focusing on things which are efficient. I think, Marika's, your point around sort of standardized processes is really important. So we reduce costs of capital, but also thinking that we are going to need probably in the next sort of 5 years at least, sort of quite a lot of hand-holding and support. So I think what I would think about is perhaps at every relevant local level, whether that's a local authority, a city region, a combined authority, that there is a particular plan for supporting SMEs through this process. And I mean, that's probably to actually make that very local. And then obviously CDFIs plug into that very well. But if there's a sort of docking point within every region, within every LEP and so on, that would be really good. So
like it, so to your green enterprise development agency being a federal structure with these sort of local partnership hubs, I can see it forming already.
There you go.
Others like to jump in. Shanika, yes.
Yeah, it's a slightly different perspective and a spin-off of your question, but a really important thing that we're grappling with is this standardization point and measurement, because it's very easy to set targets and have finance flow through the system, but if everyone's measuring it differently and there isn't a consistent vocabulary of what success looks like, and I think that will undermine the provision of finance unless we get to a standard principle of measurement, a standard set of definitions, a standard taxonomy of whether we're applying European or UK or other types of definitions. I think that is going to be an obstacle that finance providers, as well as SMEs, as well as development institutions like ourselves, will grapple with for a long time unless we get to grips with this quickly.
Yeah, very good. And you mentioned the taxonomy word, the word that strikes fear into the hearts of every European at the moment. I think that one of the interesting things for SMEs is being able to look at supply chain scope 3 carbon. I mean, how would you even start? And that's something which I think now going to the Q&A, we've got one from a hypothetical business, but I think it's an entirely believable one, saying, well, given that there's been so much suffering and things to kind of withstand at the moment in terms of COVID, how can businesses be persuaded that the net zero goals should get to the top of the list of priorities? And I suppose to maybe extend that, how both for SMEs and for CDFIs or finance providers, can net zero be framed genuinely as an opportunity as opposed to another burden to carry, another thing to do on top of a full overloaded agenda? Who's got thoughts or ideas on that?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because the narrative of something being compliance-led or a regulatory burden versus it being an opportunity creates different behaviors. And so the behaviors that we want are the opportunity, the incentive, the innovation that comes from the creative thinking of seeing something as a positive rather than as a negative. So that's sort of a really important starting point as to why I think we do need to create the narrative around it being an opportunity. And how do we do that isn't a straightforward question, actually. There's going to have to be a lot of experimentation in this. But if you use access to finance as a starting point and create incentives, greater incentives for those who are moving to transition quicker than others, I think that creates a sense of opportunity and behaviors to try and catalyze people to get on that bandwagon.
Yeah, I think it comes also to this issue about packaging the right advice with finance. And I mean, as finance providers, obviously we have a great opportunity when we're working with a client and we're looking at business plans and so on to see where change can be made. So I do think there is a lot around sort of the openings we get, but also being able to provide either directly or have access to these advisory services that many SMEs are going to need in order to be able to think through, you know, if they invest in this, okay, it's a cost in year 1, year 2, but in terms of revenue streams and efficiency gains, you know, you get it down the road. And I mean, that seems to me just the sort of hand holding that a lot of SMEs that I'm aware of are really going to need.
I'd like to rejoin one of the other questions so you can build on that, but there's one question from John Peters there really talking about, isn't there a significant risk here that there's a large swathe of SMEs who are going to be left out in the cold, and as regulation comes in or as banks respond to certain pressures and criteria and targets, that they're just not going to be able to access the finance, and that they kind of that they're not able to transition, and maybe CDFIs, if they don't get the funding, aren't going to be able to kind of help them. What's the protection mechanism, the backstop for these businesses who might otherwise be just unable to be supported in that transition?
One thought, James, on that. I mean, you mentioned earlier the sort of Community Reinvestment Act in the States, and that was linked to the problem of redlining, often on sort of racial grounds, but certainly income grounds in the US. And I think there could be an unintended consequence of a purely risk-based approach to climate action, building on what Shanika was saying, which we've coined greenlining, that actually you could have sort of rational actors actually maybe making cost of capital, access to capital harder to certain sectors or indeed certain regions because of a risk, a sort of rational concern about exposure to carbon. So I think it's something we need to head off. So obviously climate risk assessment, absolutely essential, a necessary factor, but not sufficient, and needs to be supported by this opportunity-led approach and sort of place-based approach that Shanika was talking about. And so we might find ourselves that there could be, I mean, all the big banks are going through stress tests at the moment, but we could find actually, if you looked across all those, you'll have particular clusters and regions and so on that will have concentration risk about the transition. And we should be really thinking hard about that and actually focusing our efforts to provide the capital, as you say, for CDFIs. What can innovation agencies do, like Innovate UK? What can the BBB do, and so on, and with the new UK Infrastructure Bank? Because there will be these clusters which could have unintended consequences of actually sort of either higher cost of capital or actually maybe reduced access to capital.
Excellent point. Others like to come in on this?
Yeah, it's a few bits, James, if I may. So it was, I really get that measurement point. If we can't measure and be consistent in the way we measure things, actually life becomes a real struggle if we aren't sort of competing almost on a level playing field of what the task really is. And some may know that Triodos is part of PCAF, if you like, carbon accounting for financial institutions, and sort of really trying to set the standards for financial institutions and how they account for carbon, not only within the organization, but actually within the investment, and more importantly. So really trying to set standards there. And I think that's desperately important. I do think the dialogue piece is actually just having and starting the dialogue is super important to this. Because actually I think when you start breaking it down, rather than just looking at it as a whole, net zero, actually just start breaking down what individual SMEs do, actually they can say, oh, this is the easy bit to tackle it, in the same way the government did. what they looked at easily tackle, relatively easily tackle initially was, well, we need to get a load of renewable energy going. So let's give that a big kickstart. And so an SME can do that in its own business effectively. But I think there was one point, and it actually came up in a conversation I had with Exeter University as well, is that transferring is the language used from a cost to an investment opportunity. And so that how it's discussed with a customer as, if you like, if society's moving this way, if you like, we have to, well, marketing, where's our market? We have to transfer as well. And so our customer, their customers effectively will also want to see this within their organization. So if you like, it's an opportunity rather than strictly talking about it as a cost of achieving net zero, in my view.
That's great. I maybe just add as well, so anyone picking up those points, but just picking up on Nick, your point on risk-based, so climate risk, with things like the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, with a lot of the pricing now based upon, well, is there going to be a loss suffered because of your exposure? That's different to whether or not you're contributing to climate change. It may just be because you are particularly exposed to the risks and increasingly physical risks of climate change. I would point out that there is a discussion at the moment from the Resilient Cities Network, which is actually developing a resilience finance framework for CDFIs, but predominantly in the US, and I think it's something which will come into here. We've all learned a lot more about resilience and our supply chains from COVID. Are those suppliers still around and operating and open? How do we kind of have that frame as well, but have it as a supportive one rather than being the only way to get finance to flow? Anyone like to come in before I go to next sets of questions? Maybe Marika.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on a couple of points here. So it's been mentioned, the obviously COVID-19 situation, and obviously Innovate UK has been providing COVID-19 loans to SMEs, and I think that was really important, and sort of when the crisis happened. But I think we need to think beyond that. And one thing that we've been doing is to look into what kind of finance all of our SMEs have been able to access. And it's very clear from the research that we've done that there has been a real dip as part of the pandemic. And you asked earlier on, James, what I would like to see from the finance and investment community. I think gain confidence quickly, because we need the finance. Okay, it's quite an issue for some of the SMEs to just access finance at the moment because of the confidence in the whole sort of situation, if you like. So I think that's really important. Innovate UK, of course, I think we will need to look at different support mechanisms. So clean tech fund, that type of thing, where we provide initial cornerstone investment and others come on board. I think there's huge opportunity to be quite creative and innovative. And I think within Innovate UK, we're starting these conversations at the moment. So really quite an opportunity and lots of options, I think, for us that we need to think about. I think, what else did I want to say? I have forgotten, I'm sorry. It will come back to me in a minute, okay. But yeah, sorry. But yeah, these points I think are really important from my point of view.
Yeah. There's so much here. I'd like to pick on, there's a group of questions which have come in really kind of, picking up, Christine, your theme is well articulated in terms of the need for CDFIs to get the right forms of capital and support, either through the guarantee mechanisms and in terms of primary investment. One question is, well, why aren't they getting the level of support, in particular, maybe the recognition from government? So from a diagnosis point of view, despite the fact that, well, there's a lot going on, what is it that could tilt the balance in terms of government support? And what is most critical right now in terms of maybe there's the guarantee mechanisms and being able to channel finance through this sector to SMEs? What is it? What are the arguments which need to be heard by the policymakers? What are the key arguments which are going to be compelling for that change?
Shall I start again, James?
Sure.
And this is one that there's still discussion and debate around, and it's interesting because actually it's the trade-offs that's the biggest question, I think, because in furthering the agenda around transition to net zero, in a resource-constrained environment, what are you having to give up? So, you know, the question around, does this mean that some sectors are left behind? Does this mean that some types of SMEs who aren't on board with it don't get the access to the finance? I think what's really important in articulating the policy question is also understanding what the compromises are and what the trade-offs are. So we've been looking at many different solutions, ranging from exactly this guarantees, where there might be stepped guarantee fees based on whether you're more proactive around net zero or not. Things like working with Innovate UK and where are the R&D type of businesses which need to be supported once they've had their initial funding to continue to scale and grow. Like, we've looked at the whole spectrum of variety of products that we could do, and who are the types of institutions that are mobilized in this space, startup loan and how we measure things. The bit that is really challenging is articulating those trade-offs, because there are trade-offs, and accepting that if we're going to get to net zero, we need to be willing to make those compromises and be open about those compromises being what takes us to the next stage of sustainability as a nation.
Great. Others in terms of, I mean, maybe in the sharp end with kind of dialogues with policymakers or others in terms of getting the finance to where it needs to go.
Just a sort of a kind of an historical observation here. I mean, this country is still hugely dominated by the commercial banks. I mean, something like 80% of lending into the SME sector historically has gone through the banks. And prior to COVID, there had been sort of quite good progress in terms of the alternative finance sector more generally, including fintech, making inroads and doing, by product innovation and funding innovation, was really bringing to the SME finance field, really what was needed. And then, of course, COVID hit, and bang whap, we've sort of gone back to almost, square zero, because so much of the necessary, government's response to dealing with COVID and getting money out quickly into the SME sector, went back to the traditional methods of using the banks. I mean, a good example is, as a CDFI, our average loan was like 45K before COVID, but with the introduction of bounce back loans, which we were not, we weren't invited, or we were not able to administer, the sub 50K lending market was taken from under us. So sadly, as we start 2021 and we talk about, the net zero agenda and things, we need to rethink the financial ecosystem and about how all these different actors really fit in, and who has what comparative advantage to do what. And I know Theodora, because she's had many conversations with Treasury and others about this. And I mean, Shanika, you at the British Business Bank are well placed to sort of help advance this agenda. But it's one of those conversations you have and you think you made some inroads, and you sort of walk away and have a cup of coffee, and it's like it just never happened.
It's very interesting, and maybe just to draw a parallel, I mean, Shanika mentioned about trade-offs. There's another trade-off maybe here between the diversity of the financial system and the CDFIs, in a way, what's happened from COVID, where it's sort of got squeezed back, as you said, Crichton, but the standardization is what, and from Amarasekara, from your research, what investors, any financial investors, we all want it to look quite cookie cutter and sort of one size fits all. How do we resolve this tension for policymakers between the benefits of diversity in the sector versus the needs for standardization? That's a kind of an extra kind of question bolted on, but probably very relevant for the government narrative. Any thoughts on that from others?
Hope it's okay if I come in there. I think dialogue is important. So I've been working with Treasury quite a bit on the advisory services for local authorities. Obviously, representing local authorities, and it's quite nice to see now that they're starting to, first of all, come along to the meetings, okay, and gain an understanding. And I think it's important for local, let's phrase this a bit more widely. It's not just local authorities, it's really the project developers, okay, that I'm talking about here. It could be also businesses, but basically particularly with local authorities, to recognize them as really important partners in all of this, okay, because they have decision-making powers as well in this field. And I have always argued that the government needs to develop a better relationship there and see the local delivery partners and to treat them as partners and listen to what they've got to say. And I think that's a really important message, because that doesn't always happen. In terms of the standardization, I think particularly with the local projects, we're working on this already. You know, we've developed a framework that we are now consulting on with the project developers or the local authorities, as I'm calling it, to see whether they would like to work with that. And we're moving them forward a little bit. And I think the key thing that we always mention is, of course, you can continue with just securing grant funding for all of your projects, but you're not going to get to the point where you scale and where you achieve net zero. So there needs to be this shift, and to really have a lens on finance and investment, really, for the project developers, the local ones, if that makes sense. It's really important, I think. And once there is an understanding that finance and investment is such a key consideration in all of this, then I think the framework falls into place. You know, people sort of buy into it more easily, the whole standardization. They can see why that is necessary. So that's that side. On the finance side, what we've been finding is that there also needs to be an understanding about how projects get delivered locally and what's important in that context. So there's often a sort of, you know, it's not all about revenues particularly for local authorities. It's a lot more. So the additional benefits need to be understood much, much better, okay, and also communicated from a local authority point of view if we want to make this work. So yeah, and I think I'm sort of hoping that there will be a much better understanding from the government side in terms of how important that the local delivery is, the place-based delivery. We're seeing quite a lot of activity in this field at the moment, and Innovate UK is working on a net zero strategy, and that includes place-based delivery of projects, of course. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how that sort of plans out. So yeah.
So I mean, interesting to kind of keep on this train, because I think that you really laid out very clearly there. There will be normalization as people get comfortable with kind of frameworks, but there probably is still a choice and a pathway as to whether, like Carbon Trust before it, the National Investment Bank, Infrastructure Bank, is setting that out at a sort of a national level with national partnerships. Ultimately, the projects will be place-based, they're in a place, but will the partnerships really include some of those things that Nick, you referred to about sort of the LEPs and universities, maybe as part of this regional federated structures, the CDFIs, will it kind of have that partnership approach, or will it be top down? Maybe other thoughts there around sort of what's important to the sector and what's going to be important ultimately to the SMEs in these journeys.
Maybe, James, I'll pick up something which Simon highlighted at the beginning, is that, in a sense, building on what Mariaka was saying, which I think is really helpful, is that it's not just that the sort of the local authorities or the combined authorities are delivery agencies of national policy. Often they're much more ambitious. And actually, it's two-way. Actually, the government can learn from what's happening in places which actually are doing things on the ground and so on. So I think if we have that sort of two-way dynamic, it's not just you have a national policy and then you need a local delivery partner, but actually local communities, governments, and so on are often taking things which are more ambitious than the overall UK policy. And that's really important, because actually, if we're going to get as a nation to 2050, obviously we need some places, some sectors, some businesses going much faster than others. So on average, we're all there by 2050. So I think that's a two-way development, and that really speaks to the innovation capacity. And I think the advisory frameworks that are being set up, the services being set up, and we see if that's a two-way relationship, I think that will be very, very healthy.
And maybe staying on that, but bringing in others, maybe Simon, Marika, with an international kind of perspective. There's been a question of, well, where is that working well elsewhere? I mean, in the UK, it's I think that we've already heard demonstration, and Simon brought in these examples of local places setting more ambitious agendas, but local government's pretty constrained right now in terms of cash and long-term investment. Where could we as the UK take inspiration from examples around the world of where this is being done well locally? Nick, you might have ideas, but others as well might have things that you take personal inspiration from.
I guess I take personal inspiration from countries where there's more devolved powers, but also budgets. And I think that's a key thing we need to think about in this context. There is currently no responsibility for local authorities to do anything about net zero, but obviously they want to do things, which is really good, I think, but it needs to be supported in the right way. And, you know, if you look at, let's say, Scandinavian cities, you know, who are normally doing quite well in terms of net zero, budgets get allocated to places in a lot more, I would say, in a more coherent way. So what we have at the moment in the UK is, I think, particularly in grant funding, it's coming out from different places and different sort of times. So obviously what the local authorities involved in our program are telling us is it's not helpful because they have to compete as well. So could we do something around really looking at a place and what kind of investment is required to get to net zero, and what are all of the funding and investment and financing sources to get there, and how do we mobilize this? I think that would be a very sort of useful exercise. I'd like to see more of that, because I think where we are at the moment, that's not enough. Okay, it won't deliver if we won't deliver net zero if we just have grant funding put here and there, and we're trying to bring that together at the local level. No, I think what needs to happen is we have that upfront budget agreed, and then we bring in additional finance to support it, I think. And yeah, I'd like to see more movement in that respect.
Yeah, no, great. And sort of it brings together that missing map of the system and greater devolution. Other thoughts on this theme, or kind of the other questions which we've touched upon? Any other international examples, or how can we get this money flowing more into the local regions? What are the mechanisms? Given that it's going to be, I mean, SMEs are going to be mostly expected at the moment to be paying the costs, and it's done at a time of intense uncertainty. Is this the right thing to invest in right now, or is there going to be a scheme or a grant or something which is going to take care of this in the future from the government? So how can we get that money flowing down to local level to be able to support local business?
James, it's a related, again, a slightly different point, but related. And looking at international examples, we've been trying to look at the linkages between local and national as well. And there's a really interesting correlation when you look at jobs as well, because the nature of jobs that are being created in regions, and that's shaping the future of the economy in terms of what jobs are being created and what education is being given around net zero related to those industries, and the connectedness between those industries forming clusters in particular regions, and the impact on not just net zero, more broadly on societal issues and ESG related themes in those regions, and then allocating particular initiatives to those regions targeting those sectors and what the economy of that region would look like is a really interesting phenomena that we're seeing in countries like Canada and Scandinavia.
Yes, I know myself that there's a bank on the West Coast in the US called Beneficial State Bank, which has been involved in quite a lot of mapping of the whole transition. So where's the the at risk of transition businesses? Where are the new starts? How is it going to work? What investment is required also in training and development and skills and capacity building? We've got through a lot of things today. I'm going to give a last kind of quick closing in a moment to everyone on the panel. I think that we've heard several themes here and several really kind of practical examples and tools from, I mean, Shanika, really interesting in some of these ideas and concepts like the stepped guarantee funds, fees, which might be able to kind of help enable this flow of finance into well, we haven't really kind of had the Build Back Better that was promised, but how can we mobilize this Build Better forward? How might we be able to repurpose, as Christine said, some of the startup fund, loan fund tools into support of local economies? How might we have this devolved, diversified, sort of or federated structure where we have the benefits of normalized, standardized approaches that Marika said, whilst having the proximity approach of the LEPs and universities and CDFIs and local partners? And how do we have the partnerships between the different pools of finance, be they the CDFIs, values-based banks, like Triage and others, the crowdfunding community? How is that stitched together at a local level? I'm recognizing it's time, so maybe not time to kind of round off. So I'm going to pass back to Theodora, maybe for a few closing words, but just want to thank all the panelists for a really engaging discussion today.
Thanks, James. Yeah, that was a really interesting and exciting discussion, and I hope it provided a lot of food for thought for everyone who's listening in and on the panel as well, to take forward in different ways. If you do want to work with us on this, please do get in touch with us at Responsible Finance. And finally, just would like to say thank you again to all of our brilliant speakers. A really, really interesting discussion, and thank you to everyone who listened in today. Hope everyone has a good rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.